Modern monetary theory, or MMT for short, is the new kid on the economic theory block, and it has a growing fan club among progressive Democrats, including the outspoken Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. The most widely followed popularizer, though, is Stephanie Kelton, professor of economics at Stony Brook University, author of the book The Deficit Myth, and formerly both the senior economic advisor to the 2016 Bernie Sanders presidential campaign and the chief economist for the Democrats on the Senate Budget Committee. To help us make sense of this theory, today we're privileged to be joined by Luigi Zingales and Bethany McLean, co-hosts of the podcast Capitalisn't. Dr. Zingales is a professor of entrepreneurship and finance at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business, and Ms. McLean is a contributing editor at Vanity Fair, a columnist at Yahoo Finance, and a contributor to CNBC. We hope you'll give their show a listen, especially their August 2020 episode on this topic. Together we discuss just what does this theory posit. Is it really the case that deficits don't matter? Can governments like the U.S., which enjoy a dominant currency like the dollar, really print money and spend without concern for the amount of national debt this might amass? And can they pull that off without necessarily igniting high inflation? Stay tuned as we discuss all this and more right now on the Retirement Lifestyle Show.
Welcome to the Retirement Lifestyle Show. Today's episode is the most people we have ever had on today's episode, which is very exciting. I'm joined by my co-hosts Roshan Loungani and Erik Olson. For any new listeners or new viewers, my name is Adrian Nicholson. We are here as always to help you learn the strategies and tactics to navigate towards a fuller, higher impact, and more joyful life. As a reminder, we are available on streaming platforms on the internet or through your phone. We also have a YouTube channel you can find by typing in Retirement Lifestyle Show in your search box, and you'll have access to over 150 videos. Please like and subscribe. Lastly, check out our website, retirementlifestyleshow.com. That contains all of our content. Roshan, I'm passing the virtual mic over to you to introduce our guest today and the topic. Let's go.
Excellent. Thank you, Adrian. Great introduction. We are more than excited to have Luigi Zingales and Bethany McLean with us. They're hosts of the show podcast Capitalisn't, and their website where you can check out all their episode is Capitalisn't, CAPITALISNT.com. A little bit of background. Luigi is a professor at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business, and Bethany McLean is a journalist, and she's contributing editor to Vanity Fair. She's known for writing on the Enron scandal and the 2008 financial crisis. And we are more than excited to have you today. Our topic we're going to talk about is modern monetary theory. And this was suggested by one of our listeners. So first, Luigi and Bethany, thank you so much for joining us.
Our pleasure.
Oh, I'm so great. Yeah, so Luigi and Bethany, first of all, I just did listen to the episode that you previously had recorded on modern monetary theory. I think if I recall correctly, it was in August of 2020. Really wonderfully done. Very informative. I loved also the fact that you had a guest, John Cochran, there. And so for our listeners, we do absolutely want to point you to that episode itself if you have an interest stimulated by the conversation we're going to have today to go deeper, because I'm sure that is a very much deeper treatment than we'll be able to accomplish here today. But the whole show is just really, I think, provocative in thinking about evaluating capitalism and what its capabilities are, and where it sings and where it could be reappraised. And by the way, Luigi and Bethany, for your benefit, our listeners would know this already. In a different way, we've come at that same question, and there's a number of guests that we've had here that have really thought about the way in which they use business to accomplish much more than just a financial bottom line, but also a social, environmental, and spiritual bottom line. And we've had some amazing guests from the Philippines and from Thailand, formerly and now in the U.S., as well as from Mozambique, who've come and talked about their businesses and how they're using entrepreneurial approaches to alleviate poverty and other kinds of social maladies. So anyway, thank you for your commitment to evaluating this subject and for being our guest. So I wanted to just frame the question that my client had posed. And I think what I'm going to do is just start from the general and then work to the specific here just quickly. So I think the broad concern that I hear from my clients, and this is not new to the advent of the term modern monetary theory, but it is to what extent is our society's apparent commitment to spending more than we take in tax revenues, and then the accumulation of that growing body of national debt, is that an issue? And in the past, it was a debate of how much. And then I think what modern monetary theorists have done, and you certainly correct me if I'm wrong, and by the way, we invite correction. So we love to learn, and telling us, no, Erik, you're flat wrong is a great way for us and our listeners to learn. So that's just fine. But the perception, at least, is that modern monetary theory for the first time went beyond what anything that Keynesian economists had said, in that, hey, there are times when it makes sense to deficit spend, and transformed it to, well, anytime there's anything less than full employment, if you have a printing press and you're a sovereign currency, you just go right ahead and print what you need to print and borrow what you need to borrow, and that way you won't have slack capacity. And so that set in motion, that general framework seemed to set in motion a political conversation that said, all right, well, now the gloves are off and we can just go to limitless amounts of spending and borrowing and money printing, and lost, at least at the political conversation, were some of the constraints maybe that the theorists themselves had introduced. So with that as backdrop, help my clients understand why they either should get ready for the collapse of the civilization, or they should instead feel great relief, like many of the adherents of this are saying, that this is going to usher in a golden age, or something in between. How's that for a framing of the problem?
That's pretty dramatic.
Yes, well, that's good radio right there.
Absolutely. So I think that our listeners probably will remember the rise of Ronald Reagan and the campaign he did on lowering taxes. And part of that campaign was based on the so-called Laffer curve. I don't know if you remember
absolutely.
The story, but it's an economist that said that basically if you decrease the marginal tax rate, you are going to induce people to work so hard and to report more taxes that your tax revenues will actually go up. Okay, so it seems like an opportunity to have the cake and eat it too. Is kind of fantastic. You have lower marginal tax rates and the government gets more taxes. How can you refuse that? Now, what is interesting is the Laffer curve is either obvious or wrong, and most likely in the way it was interpreted was wrong. And then you will explain in a second why I make this analogy, because at some level, the Laffer curve is obvious that if you tax people 100%, you get zero revenue because nobody's going to work, right? So if you are at 100% tax rate and you decrease a little bit the taxes, probably what Laffer was saying is correct. Okay, so in a sense, there is an element of truth in the Laffer curve. Now, the way it was used was saying that at the moment in the United States, if you decrease marginal tax rate, revenues will go up. And we did the experiment and was false. And basically every country that has done the experiment has been false. So they didn't drop as much as you would expect otherwise. So there is a compensating effect. But the fact that you reduce the marginal tax rates and revenue go up is not true. However, was a fantastic political sort of trope to basically reduce tax rates. So why do I say that? Because the theory, which I think Krugman said is not modern, is not really about monetary, it's not even a theory, but the theory is really very similar, except that it's from the left. Okay, so what they are saying that, yes, if you control your currency, so if you're not a country like Italy, for example, the country where I come from, that is part of the euro area, so Italy cannot print its own currency. Now, we want to talk about later countries like Argentina, which are in the middle. But if you're a large country like the United States that is able to have people accept their money as a final form of storage of wealth, and you are below productive capacity, you can print a little bit more of money, and you're going to have basically a little bit more of GDP. So is this argument possible in some situation and etc.? Absolutely. Okay? Now, is it in general true that you can print all money you want and not worry about inflation or anything like that? Absolutely not. Now, the term when you say the government has control of its currency or monetary sovereignty is a little bit tricky, because the United States clearly have a unique privilege in the world that people take dollar as payment everywhere in the world. Okay, so the United States have what some economists call an exorbitant privilege, that they can pay for their import in dollars, and they don't need to get anything else. So they print dollars and they get foreign goods. Now, this is not true for most countries in the world. Even Japan, people might accept some yen, but eventually people want to convert yen into dollar or their own currency. So that's a little bit more tricky for other countries. But for the United States, there is clearly a huge demand for dollars in the world. And so you can play this game a bit more than other countries. So if you go back to Argentina has tried to play this game, ain't working, because the moment you start printing pesos, people are afraid that you have too many pesos. They try to convert pesos into dollars, and all of a sudden you have inflation instantaneously. Now, the best example for theory is actually Japan. Japan, they print yen, and people are still willing to hold yen. Now, first of all, there are two things that are quite important. There is a history in Japan of the yen being a very strong currency, so people are attached to that because of that. There will be a day in which you realize that the yen is not such a strong currency, and that day, when you realize, is a bit too late. And second, there is still quite a bit of savings in Japan, so that most of the Japanese debt is actually held by Japanese institutions, and most of these institutions are forced to buy that debt. So Japan is in a very drug economy kind of system that works until it doesn't. And so I think that the long story short is, can the government print more money and push the economy a little bit farther? I think that in some situation, the answer is definitely yes. This is what, ironically, Trump has done. Trump has lowered taxes, increased the deficit, pushed the economy farther before the COVID recession, and worked fine. So it is possible to do a little bit. Now, what is too much? This is the problem, is nobody knows really what is too much, and you only know after you have realized, and that's too late. So that's where it's pretty scary. Sorry, I spoke too long.
No, you didn't speak too long.
Luke, I have a follow-up question for you. Does this make you a fan of cryptocurrency? Your description is what a lot of crypto people say. That's why you got to go all in on crypto. So,
except I don't really see the use value of cryptocurrency. In a sense, to me, the real use value of cryptocurrency in this moment is for Russian oligarchs or corrupt Saudi princes to store some of their money as an hedge. So if I have my money illegally accumulated or accumulated legally, but in a very repressive countries, and I fear revolution, and I have a lot of it, putting $10 million into something that might be worthless, but with small probability, I can access it anywhere in the world when I'm running away, has a pretty high value if I have $1 billion. Okay?
Yeah.
Because having $1 billion and having 990 million doesn't make a huge difference. But having zero, having 10 million may make a huge difference. And so, as an edge against extreme situation, I think that the cryptos are pretty good. For anything else, I don't see the purpose.
Can I jump in with a quick comment?
Please.
So what has always intrigued me about MMT and where we are now as a country is that it's being enacted, even though most people would fight against the idea that it is MMT, but that's essentially what we're doing, and essentially, by the way, what President Trump started doing. But it's being done now under the guise of helping those at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder, because the spending obviously will help them, and the idea that we can get to full unemployment will help. And this Federal Reserve is one that believes that unemployment is the worst Scrooge for those at the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, that the best thing we can do to help is make sure that there's full employment. But the irony of all of this is that the thing that wrecks MMT is inflation. And inflation is the thing that takes the biggest bite out of those at the bottom end of the socioeconomic spectrum. So the very people who this policy is meant to help are also the ones who bear the brunt of it when it goes wrong. And that's what I think makes me most skeptical. So that point is very obvious, right? And so then really what are we doing, given that the very people we're supposedly helping are the ones who are going to suffer the most if this experiment goes wrong?
But I think that Bethany raises an excellent point, which is we need to separate the economic idea from the political idea. And unfortunately, in the United States, the two have been mixed so much that it's hard to tell apart. But really, the first proponent and implementer of so-called modern monetary theory, even if maybe it was not called that way, was Adolf Hitler. Hitler, when he took over power in 1933, he started to expand massively the monetary base, paying for rearmament with that money, and kind of forcing German people, and then all the people in the other countries that Germany later occupied, to hold the German mark. That was kind of a very effective way to expand military power, delaying the cost, and at some level, not having the cost, because it is true that Germany was coming out of a period of deflation with a lot of unemployment, and Hitler fixed that. So one thing is, can we use money to revitalize the economy? In some situation, yes, there are some consequences, etc. And then the second is what we use the money for. Okay, now the moment you say we use it for the green economy, everything is beautiful. If you use it for armament, that is terrible. But the principle is the same. So I think we should be very cognizant of that.
You touched on something, Bethany, what you just said. I found it really interesting in your podcast episode, The Right and Wrong of MMPT, that was from October 2020. You had a phrase you used. You said it's the ultimate expression of privilege. And you and Luigi had a brief discussion on that. Can you go over that again? I just found that incredibly interesting.
Well, I think what I meant is that it's the privilege of a wealthy country that controls its own currency to be able to engage in MMT, and the privilege of a country that believes that other countries are willing to buy its debt. But I think now that now that we have inflation in this country and we're realizing who bears the cost, I think there's another way to think of the privilege, which is that it's also the privilege of those who don't have to worry about how much it costs to fill their tank with gas or how much it costs to put food on the table, to believe that they can engage in policies that ostensibly help people because then we all feel really good about ourselves, but actually may have a really, really dangerous cost. So I think there's several levels to the privilege. Luigi, would you answer that differently?
Not really. I think that I will emphasize that this privilege is what economists call the exorbitant privilege of the United States. By being the world reserve currency, you can pay for your input in printed paper. And that's a enormous benefit that has been going on since World War II, but is ironically is a benefit that is really at risk now. And abusing of it by printing more and etc. is only guaranteeing that this goose from the golden eggs is going to die sooner. So I think it is a real issue.
There's also on that note, and I don't know what you all think about this, but I've been, some people have raised this as a concern with me, and so it's something I'm mulling over, that there's this, it puts the Fed in a really odd position. You know, one of the tenets of the United States is that the Fed is an independent central bank, right? And yet, if we have to keep our debt cheap, if we have to keep the interest rate on our debt cheap, what does that mean for the nexus between fiscal policy and monetary policy? Can the Fed stay independent when the Treasury and the financing of the United States depend on our interest rates staying low? Does that put pressure on the Fed, for instance, to continue its policy of buying of quantitative easing, of buying assets in order to reduce the interest rate? Does that put pressure on the Fed to keep interest rates low instead of raising interest rates in order to counter inflation? How independent can the central bank be at a time when the United States needs interest rates to stay really low?
Yeah, I'd love to explore that with you a little bit.
Bethany has explained very well what we economists call fiscal dominance. That when you have a debt that is too large, the central bank has to help finance that debt, and because of that burden, they can't really control interest rates. And because if they wanted to increase interest rate to fight inflation, will make the financing of the debt impossible.
Yeah. So
or too expensive, and so as a result, they accommodate, and the answer is inflation.
Yeah. So let me just put some numbers on that.
Let me just ask a basic question before that. So is, Bethany, the answer to your question simply they can't be independent?
I don't know. I think
basic?
we're in uncharted territory here, right? And I think, I don't even know if we're going to find out, because if some of the forces driving inflation prove to be transitory, as the Fed has said, and as some people still believe, then we may not end up in a situation where the Fed needs to raise interest rates in order to blunt inflation. And so we may not find out how independent the central bank can actually be, but we may find out. So I think I think we're headed for really interesting times. Luigi,
I remember.
I think that I agree with you. I think that the notion of independence has been, I think, exaggerated everywhere in the literature. So what does it mean to be independent? Maybe it means that you cannot be fired instantaneously. First of all, there was some discussion during the Trump administration whether actually the chairman could be fired. But first of all, you want to be probably reappointed for 4 years after. So there is some sense of loyalty there. But more importantly, if I'm telling you, imagine that, Roshan, you are the next chairman, and I'm telling you that if you raise interest rates, then the deficit will skyrocket because we have to pay a higher rate on our debt. The deficit will skyrocket. And as a result, we need to cut food stamp for 10 million people who are going to die of starvation in the street. I'm exaggerating a bit, but let's say. Do you feel confident on doing that? And if you kind of cave in, are you not independent or are you simply a human being? So I think that they're putting you in a situation that is really, really difficult to handle. That's what fiscal dominance is, that you are so trapped by the conditions that you can't escape.
Right. So I want to just put some numbers to that, because it's one thing, when you start actually looking at the real numbers that are being spent. In 2020, the U.S. federal government brought in $3.4 trillion of revenues. I grant that 2020 was a bit odd insofar as we had a global pandemic. We spent $6.6 trillion. And of that, there was a certain amount that was known as mandatory spending, and then a certain amount known as discretionary spending. But one part of that was spending interest to finance the debt. And so now the debt is $30 trillion. So if you have interest rates that are low, and I'll just to make it the math super simple as for our listeners, let's say that the interest is 1%. So that's the cost of the federal government having to borrow to cover $30 trillion of debt. I'll just do the math. 1% of that it's costing them $300 billion a year to cover that interest cost. $300 billion. And that's of that, they're essentially, we're saying almost a tenth of their receipts in 2020 then would be earmarked for covering that interest cost. So what happens if the interest rate rises to, let's just say, triple that, and the debt grows a little bit? Now, instead of it being $300 billion, it's $1 trillion that is the cost of financing that debt. And so now you're taking $1 trillion of receipts, even if you boost receipts to $4 trillion, but 25% of the money that you're taking in is being used to cover just the interest cost on what you've already spent and haven't paid for. You're on this sort of snowballing effect of more and more debt, more and more interest financing cost, or debt financing cost, and more debt being piled on to the existing 30 trillion. So that seems to be the cycle that you have to figure out how to unwind it. You've talked about what it does as one effect of that is it hampers the Fed potentially from combating inflation. But I think there are other adverse effects as well. I know that a lot of our clients have been pushed to leave bonds as a portion of their portfolio because they feel like they can't afford to own them because they're not doing anything for them except maybe dampening some volatility. So they have to then swing over more and more into risk assets, changing the composition of their portfolio, at least from what we've historically considered to be an appropriate portfolio mix for people who are in their retirement. Your thoughts about that?
So first of all, I want to make sure that your listeners understand that your hypothesis of tripling interest rates is not science fiction, because if they were tripling, we'll only go to 3%, which was considered very low until a few years ago. So we're not talking about some science fiction experiment. We're talking about a return back to normal in any form or shape. And by the way, with an inflation, forget 7%, even with inflation at 4%, 3% nominal is negative real rate. So I think that is a really sort of important point to make. But you are raising a even more important point, which is the retiree in general, but the savers in general, are put in a very uncomfortable position, because even if you want to get Treasury inflation-protected bonds, TIPS, they have what? Negative 2.5% real rate. So you're basically paying the government to store your money. And if you had planned to have a nice retirement with your income, you cannot afford that. So I think that one aspect that we have not fully considered, in my view, is how much everybody has been pushed into stock as a result of that. This has been kind of a really taxation of the frugal and the risk averse in a way that is very virtues that we generally value. And also made everybody dependent on the stock market, because now there's not only the fiscal dominance, there is the stock market dominance that as a president, I'm not going to be reelected if the stock market drops 20%. Because all the retiree would be up in arms. It's not just some rich people that lose money. It's the retiree that say, I don't eat this year.
There's a great quote from an economist named Mohammed El-Arian right after the Fed did the rescue of the financial system in the spring of 2020. And he said, the Fed is now hostage to the stock market. And that backs up the point Luigi just made. I almost think of this in two distinct periods, and I'd love to hear agreement or disagreement with this. But part of where we are now is a reaction to the years after the global financial crisis, where the Fed employed many of the same policies that it's employing now, resulting in what in many people's mind has been a bubble in asset prices, even heading into the pandemic and the gigantic rescue package that we did then. So there was an argument in financial circles. In fact, most smart money managers I know believed that we were in a huge bubble in asset prices, and there's a lot of worry among all the people I know about all the young people in the market who not only were not around in the days of Enron, but don't even remember the global financial crisis, much less any period where interest rates were actually rising. So we have a whole generation of people who are used to super low interest rates and asset prices that only go up, enabled essentially by Federal Reserve policy. And so then we had the pandemic, and we have that same Fed policy taken on steroids, right? Even more spending, even more support for all corners of the market, from the safest of assets to the riskiest of assets. And if you believe there was a bubble in asset prices, that bubble just went crazy. And the argument was among economists at the time, or at least among policymakers, was that, well, there wasn't inflation in the years after the financial crisis, so there won't be inflation now. And I think the mistake they made was equating those two periods, and something is different now. And the question is, what's different, and is it permanently different? But the fact that there wasn't inflation in the years after the financial crisis provided ammunition of sorts for those who said this is the right policy, because we can always argue history is the same when we want it to be the same, right? and so there's a feeling among progressives that they got talked out of spending as much as they needed to in the wake of the global financial crisis by these worries about debt and budgets. And damn it, they're not making that mistake again, because the hawks the last time around were wrong. So they're going to be wrong this time too. And so the question to me becomes, what's different now? To back up to the actual question, I think most people I know, at least, and I can't help myself from being somewhat of a cynic, think that the markets are in really dangerous territories, that we've been in this period for over a decade now, where assets only go up and where people have forgotten what risk is.
Yeah, I mean, both of you brought up some really interesting concepts, and it kind of just seems like it's just like a culmination of things that are really just benefiting the markets, and it's causing people to take on more risk. Like when there's periods of high inflation, a good way to hedge against that inflation is equities, stocks, and also given just like the interest rate environment with the zero interest rate policy that has been going on with certain years, it's just kind of fueling investors just to take on more risk. And that's just really interesting, just depending on what your time horizon is, or like what state you are in as an investor. If you're someone just like getting started out, you probably are just having to take on like more risk, and you're looking at just maybe even alternatives to the market. And that's why you see people like looking at cryptocurrency or just other alternatives, which is just bringing in a lot more risk in people's portfolio. And we also had a podcast too, Erik mentioned this earlier, where people, are moving away from bonds because, again, they just can't keep pace with inflation. And that kind of can put people in a tough position, like where you're close to retiring. You have to kind of look at your portfolio where you can't take on that much risk. And one of the solutions in the past was bonds. They were kind of had that inverse relationship to equities. They paid you, and also kind of were a good way to store your money, where that's kind of being taken away more, which brings in more bubbles and people taking on a lot more risk than they otherwise would consider. So all these like policies and what's going on is kind of really changing how people are looking at the investing world, which is really interesting.
Mm-hmm. So Bethany, you asked the question also about the two periods, and I just wanted to respond to that. So I do think you're absolutely right. I think that the groundwork was laid when we had the massive response to the financial crisis in 2008, and there wasn't inflation, and so precisely the same policy. Why was it different? My understanding is more from a an economic equality, where it's not just the money. So there was enormous amounts of money supply that was being added, but the velocity of that money was it wasn't accelerating. Actually, it declined. It was cut, I think, roughly cut in half. And as a result, you had M times V. You didn't get the price rise. Here, I think that we haven't had that sharp drop off in velocity of money, and as a result, now you flood the system with that money, and that contributes to that inflation, along with all the other. I fully acknowledge the constraints, supply constraints, and the impact that's had just on the supply-demand imbalance. But I don't. In fact, maybe the two of you do understand why there's been a difference in velocity between those two periods, because I think that, for at least for me, is a really interesting distinction between those two phases.
I want to turn it back, that one over to Luigi, and also have you answer the part of the question that I don't understand, which is, what is velocity of money? What does that mean? And why should we care about it? And then to Erik's question, why is it different this time?
So velocity, in very simple term, is how fast you spend the money you receive. So if you receive some money and you hold on to it under your mattress, it's not going to create buying pressure. It's actually doing the opposite, and that contributes to slow down demand and potentially slow down prices, and vice versa. If you receive the money and you spend it right away, that it contributes to increase demand and increase prices, and what as economists we fear are potentially self-reinforcing loops, because if you are in a situation of inflation, of course, you don't want to hold on to your money, because the longer you hold on, the less is worth it. Yeah. And so you literally spend it right away, and that tends to increase velocity, and increased velocity increase prices, and that's the hyperinflation loop. And then there is also the opposite, is deflation, which is, by the way, is what happens with Bitcoin. So if you think that your money is going to be worth more tomorrow than today, you don't want to spend it. And it's just I always tell in class, the guy who bought the first transaction in Bitcoin for a real good was a guy who bought a couple of slices of pizza with the Bitcoin. At latest time I check, that pizza cost him $150 million. Okay? So I said, I'm not sure he digested well that pizza, because it's really in his stomach. So that's a way to say, if you expect your money to increase in value, you're not going to spend it. Now, if you're not going to spend it, you're not going to create demand. And so prices are going to drop. And so the value of money is going to keep going up. That's the deflation loop. So that's the reason why it's difficult to balance the two situations. Now, why the situation is different? I think the answer is very simple, is where the money went. I think that if you basically give a lot of money or a lot of liquidity to super rich people, they're not going to spend it right away. And even when they spend it, they're going to spend it in stuff that doesn't count on the CPI. So if the price of Monet double, first of all, you don't cry, because neither you nor I own a Monet. No, we are planning to buy one, by the way. At least I don't. Maybe you do, Erik. But and doesn't enter into the CPI. So yeah, the price of Monet, and you look at the world of art, prices have gone crazy, but not only recently, they've gone crazy also after the 2008 financial crisis, right? Because rich people have a lot of liquidity, were spending in money, but that did not impact inflation. If you send $2,000 to every family, you know what? They're going to spend it. Especially, they've been locked down for a year. Finally, they can go out and spend it. They're going to spend it. And they're going to spend it in what? In a car. or I don't like public transportation that much because the virus is still around. I want to buy a car. And I just received $2,000. I'm going to buy. So everybody's going to buy the car. And you know what? Cars are not going to respond that well, even without the shortages of chips, etc. Now, if you add shortages, then you're really in trouble. But forget the shortages. If 40% more of people want to buy a car now, you're not going to have a 40% increase in car overnight. So when demand outstrips supply, you have only one thing, which is increasing prices.
So, Luigi, what you just described, do you believe that inflation is transitory now, or do you think it's here to stay?
So this is the $1 trillion question. I think a lot of it is to do in how much this is ingrained in expectations, and how much of competition will bring prices down. So let's take the car example. So imagine, and I'm exaggerating here, but imagine there's a 40% increase in the demand for cars. And imagine there are no bottlenecks. The bottlenecks make things even worse, but supply cannot keep up with demand. So it's only natural that producers, when there is a situation like this, they're going to increase their supply a bit, or plan to increase their supply. It's taking a little while. But in the meantime, they're going to increase prices. Okay? Now, do you think that, number one, as the more supply will come on the line, they are going to have an excess supply, so they're going to push prices down, or not? So that's how long will it take for supply to respond, and how they're going to push prices down. The second is, if I am a worker and I'm on a fixed wage, and you know what? Last year I became 7% poorer. So today, I would like to go to my employer and say, I want a higher wage. And by the way, I'm asking 7% is the minimum, but if I already lost 7% last year, and if inflation doesn't go down to 2% or 0 this year, I'm going to lose another. So if I'm in a bargaining cycle, I'm not going to build in just the 7% of last year. I'm going to be the 7% of last year plus the whatever I expect this year. Let's say. So let's say that I want a 10% increase. So now all of a sudden, everybody, and we've seen that in restaurants, everybody finds their costs going up by 10 or 15%. And if demand was low, they will probably try to absorb part of those costs. But if demand is high, they're going to translate that cost into higher prices. And that's what generates the spiral.
So I was reading a blog post by Stephanie Kelton, actually on Substack. So for those of our listeners, I don't know that we've actually mentioned her name. So the concept of modern monetary theory is closely associated with it was the most prominent, I think, proponent of it, or at least the most, I don't know, has the biggest following, Stephanie Kelton, who, if I'm not mistaken, is a professor of economics at Sunnybrook. I'm trying to remember, I'm embarrassed that I don't remember.
I think
that.
You're right. Yeah.
So she actually had but for those of our listeners who are readers of the New York Times, there was an article published, interestingly enough, just 10 days ago. So that we couldn't have planned that. So if you go, we're recording this on February 16th. So if you go back and find your issue, or have your online subscription, it's the February 6th issue, I think. And so there's a write-up there. But on her Substack article, she deals with this question of inflation. And she says, I'm asked this all the time. How does MMT deal with this? And she says, I've answered this a million times. I'll say it again. You have to think about it in two parts. Modern monetary theory doesn't have an answer for inflation once it's kicked in. It has an answer for inflation to help how to avoid it. And so I do want to at least reference the fact that she's given thought to this. And on the subject of avoiding, though, I think it's a little bit, and this is my perspective on this, it's a little bit slippery insofar as it relies on people having the capacity to foresee what sorts of dynamics in the economy would lead to inflation. And in fact, I think it resorts to this fallacy of the experts. If we just get the Congressional Budget Office to do an analysis of any sort of proposed spending and what impact that would have on inflation in various sectors, then we know we've reached the limit. I think that's giving too much credit to experts. I think the economy is just too dynamic. It has too many moving parts for experts to know in advance precisely how that's going to work. So, but nonetheless, to her credit, she has addressed it, and that's her essential answer. Can't fix it after the fact readily, but you could prevent it if you were giving thought to where the problems might rear their ugly heads.
I just want.
But so basically, okay.
I just wanted to back up to augment that point with what actually happened in the spring of 2020 and even heading into 2021, because the experts, the Fed, kept saying there's no inflation. Whatever signs of this are transitory. And there was a piece I recently read in which the Fed predicted that inflation would stay at under 2% in either 2021 or 2022. And there was a piece written in the New York Times saying, the Fed's economists are generally right. And so those of you who think inflation is coming, basically the Fed knows what it's doing. And at the same time, you had more skeptical people, including those in the financial markets, coming out and saying, there is no way we're not getting inflation after this, given this 1-2 punch of fiscal and monetary policy and what Luigi discussed about the just sheer amount of money being pumped into the system so quickly. And those in charge said, no inflation. So just to back up your point that, it's all well and good to be able to say we'll spot inflation when it starts happening, except we just have living evidence, life in motion of trying to spot inflation when it's happening, and didn't work so well. Anyway, Luigi.
Mm-hmm.
I want to defend a little bit the experts, because there were a lot of economists that did predict that inflation will come out. Now, he's not probably the most charming of all the economists, but Larry Summers was pretty aggressive in saying upfront that inflation would be coming. And he was absolutely right. And the problem is that nobody wanted to listen. I think that this has been, in my view, the collateral damage of this MMT is that we don't want to hear the bad news. If you start to bring this idea that we can have the cake and eat it too, saying, if you eat the cake, eventually you will gain weight, I don't think is a crazy idea. Now, sure, you can have some special regime in which you eat the cake and don't gain weight, but most of the time you do. Okay, but if you start spreading the idea that all this business that eating cakes and gaining weight is completely ridiculous, people will eat more cake. There's no doubt about that, and they don't want to hear. And then when somebody say, look at your pants, they are tight because you're gaining weight. No. This is like false consciousness, and this is like you have a political agenda and whatever. And the reality is that he was right.
Look at it a different way. I think that's I love that example, Luigi, and that makes sense. It's way more fun for money to be free than for money to cost something, right? So what gets in the way of spotting inflation is what gets in the way of everything, which is human nature. So you've given some people something and said, this is free, we can do this. Oh, wait, we have to stop. There might be a warning sign here. I mean, the natural human tendency is going to be to say, oh, that red flag is just transitory, because you don't want it to be a red flag. Mm-hmm. It's human nature.
Yeah, the Fed is missing inflation and making us all fat, I guess, Luigi, huh?
Indeed. No, but I think that one aspect that we should not underestimate is what is the role of media in general, but social media in particular, in harassing the Cassandra that are needed to keep a system in place. So you need some people that tell publicly the ugly truth, because Cassandra, for those of you who don't remember the story, but she was right that the Trojan horse was a Trojan horse, okay? Yeah. And she did not end up very well in history, but she was right, and people should have listened to her. But I think that, and I think that the role of experts should be that one. However, we live in a consensus society. So if you say something that is politically unappealing, you get completely bombarded by the other side saying that you are this, you are that, and really harass online and offline. And so I think that we are silencing the Cassandras, and that's the reason why we don't see the problems when it's coming.
I think that's a really great point, because it's the political connection. It's this nexus between the expertise and then the political process that processes that expertise that I think is actually in the argument that I read, at least Stephanie Kelton framed it in this particular blog post, seems to me to be the fundamental fallacy of this working, which is the presumption is that if we ask the experts first, how far can we go? They tell us you can go to this point but no farther, then the political process will respectfully cease to persist in its spending at that point. And I don't believe that happens. I think that's utterly a misunderstanding how the political process actually works. People adopt whatever their agenda is. They'll adopt a narrative that will support that, and then persist until they're ousted, I suppose, is what, and they have another day to fight in the future when they recover their power. But I cannot see people, and by the way, Luigi, I was not trying to beat up entirely on experts. So you being an expert, with all due respect.
No, it's fine. I beat up on experts all the time, so I don't think that it is a problem. And I think the experts tend to be actually wrong a lot of time, precisely also because of this political constraint. I think that it's not that people inside the profession don't see some problems, is that they don't come out because the incentives are not there. Well, but there is another point to what you are saying that I would like to elaborate, because I find it pretty scary that she says, we know how to prevent inflation, but once it's in, we don't know how to handle it. Because it's like saying, I recommend control fires to keep up the forest problem in California. But if one goes out of hand, I don't know how to handle the situation. In a sense, if you play with fire, you need to know how to handle it when it goes out of hand. Because no matter how good you are, I think this is the importance of resilient systems. Resilient systems are the ones that are resilient to mistakes. Are mistakes by experts and also to bad luck. Sort of, the expression, as happens, it does. And if we have a system that, if it happens, we don't know how to deal with it, wait a minute. You don't want to use that as your theory, because it does not have way to handle the problem.
I think one of the that happens.
Go ahead, Bethany.
Back to that point that you two were making, which I think is incredibly important. But I think one of the problems that happens is when there's a moral element introduced to arguments that perhaps shouldn't be moral in their nature. And there has been in this particular debate, because the Fed, I think, due to a deep belief in the part of many of the people there, they believe that unemployment is the Scrooge, and that the most important thing we can do is make sure we have full employment. But it introduces this moral element to the debate, in the sense that if you say, wait, there should be a limit on spending, wait, what about inflation? You are a bad human being who doesn't care about those at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. And in reality, we should be able to separate those two things out, right? Is this the right policy? Will it contribute to inflation? What are the economic effects? And how do we take care of people and create a more equal society? But when those 2 points get blended such that anybody who raises a question is then a bad human being, and I'm speaking in overly strong terms in order to make the point, but that's where the problem comes in. And I think in so much of our society, including this debate, we introduce emotion and morality into debates that really shouldn't have either one, because there are a couple different ways to look at them.
That's a great point.
But Bethany, you will have an opportunity to actually look at the control experiment in action, because the European Central Bank does not have a dual mandate. The European Central Bank has only the mandate of price stability. So you can be the most caring person, but you should not, at least according to your mandate, look at unemployment. You should only look at price stability. Now, there is inflation in Europe, less than there is here, but there is inflation in Europe. We'll see how they handle it. And this is Christine Lagarde, who is a chairperson of the European Central Bank, came out with a very confusing speech the other day. So she's not exactly leading very clearly in that direction. So we'll see how different the outcome is due into the mandate.
Is that in part because in Europe you have such a much more robust social safety net that they don't feel it's necessary to have full employment as one of their objectives? Or is that just a byproduct of some other aspect of their history?
I think historically is that Germany was always very hawkish against inflation. And they will only agree to give up the Deutsche Mark for a euro under two conditions. Number one, that the central bank will be in Germany because they wanted to have the political pressure, speaking of, in their country. And two, that there would be only one clear mandate, the one of price stability, to avoid anybody to do anything else.
Well, so I don't know how long we can keep talking with you, but I do have one other question, which is about the inflation. So one solution to essentially reducing the real size of debt, inflation-adjusted size of debt, of course, is to permit a sustained period of excessive inflation. Because what that really does is then it permits you to pay back that 30 trillion and growing with an economy whose in nominal dollars is expanding more rapidly than perhaps the debt is, if that's possible. I don't know at this point. So, I mean, it's been sort of the secret remedy here is to essentially pull money from everyone's wealth by deflating its value and then using those magnified nominal dollars to pay down the debt. So you can charge me with cynical, but how do you respond to that?
First of all, I don't want to be too technical, but it's very important to distinguish between inflation and unexpected inflation. Okay. So if you, when you have an inflation of 2%, for example, was expected inflation 2%, the interest rate were reflecting that. And so you don't expect really that the debt will be reduced by 2% per year because they're paying an interest, which is the 2% inflation plus some real rate. If you expect inflation of 2% and you get 7%, then de facto you are taxing every holder of debt for 5% and redistributing an amount, which if it comes to the government, you're basically taxing every person the 5% and give it to the government. But also in the private sector, you are redistributing between the borrowers and the lenders for that amount, which is a significant redistribution. But that's the unexpected component. Then people catch up. So next time around, they're going to ask either a inflation clause or a high interest rate. So the impact of this reduction in the debt is only for the surprise inflation.
I see.
And that's dangerous because if you want to use that, you have to keep people surprising up. Mm-hmm. Okay, which that's exactly what hyperinflation is about. Because I go to 7 now. You're starting to build because people are not stupid. So eventually they're going to adapt that the inflation is going to be a 7. Okay, and then I need to surprise you again. I need to go to 14.
Yeah, vicious.
I also have one final question. Let's see if it's final. But it's if I'm someone listening to this podcast as an investor, how can I use what we've just discussed to at least point me in the right direction of how to invest or where to look for opportunities?
I have no clue.
Acceptable answer. Thank you very much.
You just do the usual thing. The more you save, the more you're gonna have. I don't know. I think it's a really fraught environment. I think a lot of the people out there managing money have never seen a downturn, let alone an environment of rising interest rates. So Luigi's going to have a more helpful answer.
Not much more helpful. I think Bethany is right that it's a very tough environment to be in, especially I would say for your median listener, who is somebody that is kind of older, and so is very worried about this risk because as we said earlier, you're saying generally the stock market is considered a hedge against inflation. Now, in the past, has not done particularly well during period of inflation, but is better than the alternative, which is having bonds, especially nominal bonds. However, the stock market is really kind of very pricey these days. The one other thing is to have real assets, but it's not like the real estate market is not like in a super boom. So what you would like is to borrow, especially the rates are still pretty low, borrow and buy real estate assets. Now, if you are young, that seems to be a very good strategy. But if you are old, you need to invest money. You don't want to borrow, so that's a little bit more complicated. So I think that maybe diversifying a bit your currency holdings to say, in case the dollar were to depreciate because too many of them are printed, owning some euros might not be, or Swiss francs might not be such a bad idea. So that's one strategy. And the other, try to invest in stocks that do have a good cash flow and tend to do well in period of inflation.
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you very much. So, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, well, I think we've covered a lot of territory here, and we've got an hour, so I don't want to impose that much longer on your time. So thank you. I just would say, unless there's something else, that we just wrap up. But Bethany and Luigi, thank you so much for carving out time to talk with us and share the benefit of your knowledge and wisdom with our listeners. I just want to also just once again point our listeners to the Capitalisn't Podcast, and as well as recent episodes, but also don't forget to get back to that August 2020 episode on modern monetary theory and listen to the further development of this idea that they had prior to I think are recognizing just what was unfolding in the area of inflation. And so there's other aspects of that discussion, especially with John Cochran, who was part of that conversation. Just a lot of benefit you can derive from that episode.
Yeah, I wanted to echo what Erik said. Bethany, Luigi, thank you so much for joining us. For all the listeners, again, their podcast is called Capitalisn't. The website is CIPATALISNT.com. They've great episodes for you to check out. As Erik highlighted, the modern monetary theory episode that really inspired us, along with Erik, your client who asked the question and our listener, to put this episode together. So Bethany, Luigi, thank you very much again. We really appreciate your time and joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, to all of our listeners, please like, subscribe, give us 5 stars, tell your friends and family. This has been another episode of the Retirement Lifestyle Show, and we'll be back next week.